So today we're going to review the Passover offering and the role that it plays in the scripture. And to do that, we're going to look into the book of Leviticus today, because Leviticus describes 5 different types of offerings. The reason why I wanted to discuss this today is because actually there is, when we think about most Christians, generally we will try and associate Yahshua's sacrifice with the serving a role as for forgiveness of sins and atonement. And when people approach Jews particularly and describe about Yahshua's sacrifice, one of the main reasons they reject Yahshua as being the Messiah, one of the most common arguments is actually that the Passover sacrifice is not a sin offering. And so that's the point we want to discuss today and investigate what does the Bible actually say about the Passover sacrifice, what sort of offering it is, and how does Yahshua's sacrifice relate to that specifically? So the intention is to further our understanding of the Passover sacrifice and to more correctly explain the multifaceted role that Yahshua's sacrifice has. So before we start reading, we're going to first clarify a few terms that are often used in the book of Leviticus that we'll be reading to. The first term is the word offering. So in Hebrew, that is korban. In Malayalam, when people go to church and they have communion, they call it kurbana. That comes from it's an Aramaic word, which is equivalent to the Hebrew word korban. And what that means actually is to come close to come near or to approach someone. So that's the first word. Actually, the Passover offering is called, in Hebrew, they refer to as the Korban Pesach, which means it's an offering to draw near to Yahweh. That's the purpose of the Passover sacrifice. The second word is what I just referred to as sacrifice. In Hebrew, that's zevach. And what that means is to kill or to sacrifice, specifically, usually for peace offerings or for vows. And then the last 3 terms that I wanted to define is in the English Bible, still referred to as herd, animals from the herd, animals from the flock, and birds. So those 3 terms, herd is referring, in Hebrew it's bakar, and what that is referring to is a bull or a heifer, basically cows, the male or the female. Flock is referring to sheep or goats. And one thing to keep in mind is that the young sheep and a young goat, both of them are called lambs. So lamb is not specific to sheep, but it can also refer to a young goat as well. And then the last ones are birds, which are specifically referring to doves or pigeons. So I'll do a quick summary of the 5 different types of offerings, and we'll start in the first chapter of Leviticus. We're not going to do a lot of reading. I'll try and summarize the key points for you. So the way our current chapters are divided, originally in the scripture, there was no chapters or verses as divisions, but the way it's currently divided is that the first 5 chapters correspond to a different type of offering. So the first type of offering that Leviticus talks about in chapter 1 is the burnt offering. In Hebrew, that's called olah. And what that means is something which ascends or which rises up. That's why in our version of the Bible, some different translations, they call it the ascending offering. Because what happens when they burn that animal, the smoke ascends up into heaven. And so that's why the burnt offering is called olah, because of that ascension. It's a voluntary type of offering. So one thing that a technique that's often commonly used to analyze or to think about things is a very simple technique we all used either actively or without even thinking, and many times in our life, is asking, who does it affect? What does it involve? When, where, how, and what is the purpose of it, or why? And I'm going to use that same sort of approach to go through each of the 5 offerings, because we can quickly summarize and identify the commonalities and differences between each of them. So the burnt offering, who does it affect? There's firstly burnt offering, any of the common people can offer one. And it also affects the priest. Interestingly, burnt offering is one of the few offerings where Gentiles are also able to offer. So Isaiah talks about the nations who come and trust in Yahweh. They will come to my house of prayer and they will offer their burnt offerings and sacrifices, and I will accept it. So that is one of the things which Israelites and non-Israelites would be able to offer back many years ago. What sort of animal could be offered for this, for a burnt offering? It's either a bull, a male bull, a male sheep or goat, or a bird. Now, what's interesting about this offering is there's actually different types of animals that could be allowed. And the reason for that is because Yahweh made a way so that everyone can draw near to him. Remember, this is one of the type of korban offerings, which the purpose is if someone wants to draw near to Yahweh, someone wants to approach him, this is one of the ways they can do that. And so Yahweh doesn't restrict that only so that rich people can do it. He gives an opportunity even for poor people who cannot afford one of those expensive animals. If they want to come and approach Yahweh, they also have a way to do that, whether it's a sheep or whether it's a bird. So an example of that, you remember when after Yahshua was born, and on the seventh day he was circumcised, and Joseph and Mary took him to the temple, and what they offered after the seventh day, on the eighth day, correct? Yeah, thank you. On the eighth day, he was circumcised, brought to the temple, and what they offered was 2 young pigeons. They weren't rich family. They didn't have the money to be able to afford a cow or a lamb or a sheep. And so there is a provision made depending on how much someone is financially able to afford, that even if they are poor or rich, they can still participate in this sort of offering. And so the lesson is that Yahweh is interested in the heart of the person and not in the financial status or the wealth of an individual. When can the burnt offering be offered? And this could be at any time during the year. So an example of this was Solomon. After building the temple, he offered thousands of animals as burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar. Where did that burnt offering have to be offered? In the tabernacle and in the temple, before the priest goes into the holy place, in the most holy place, there's a big altar at the front of it. And this is where the animal was brought to that altar, and the blood was brought to the altar. Some of these offerings, the blood was brought inside the holy place. But this particular offering was not brought inside the blood. It was only done at the altar in front of the holy place. How was this offering to be done? As with most of the other offerings, it was actually the person who was offering the animal who had to kill the animal. So there was a close feeling and an emotion that the offerer would experience when they put the knife to the throat of the animal and have to kill it. It's not that the priest had to kill the animal. The priest then had to take the blood and pour the blood onto the altar and arrange the meat in such a way so that it could be ready to be burned up. But the actual killing of the animal was performed by the offerer. And then what happened is when the priest would burn that animal on the altar, a sweet smell would rise to heaven in a cloud as a testimony to the offerer and their family that Yahweh has accepted them. So one thing interesting about this burnt offering is that the whole animal was burnt up, and the priest could derive no benefit from it. In some of the other offerings, the priests got some either meat or food out of the offering, and they were able to receive some benefit from the offering. But in this case, the entire thing went up to Yahweh. Neither the offerer nor the priest were able to get anything materially themselves. So an example that comes to mind when you think about that is many times Yahweh told Abraham, do this and I will bless you. I will make your seeds. I will give as great up as like stars of the heaven, like sand on the sea. They're going to possess the gates of their enemies and so forth. But one time he told, the final test he did to Abraham was, go and sacrifice your son. There was nothing in reward that Abraham could expect out of that. There was nothing for him to gain. And like this burnt offering, there was nothing for the offerer or for the priest to gain. It was a whole devotion sacrifice that was going entirely to Yahweh. And the last point is, why would people offer this burnt offering? So there was daily burnt offerings, so in the evening and in the morning each day there would be daily offerings, but also on the appointed times, on the Sabbaths, the new moons, the festivals. But the one of interest I wanted to focus on briefly is voluntary offerings as well too. It signifies a complete submission of the offerer to Yahweh and a desire to commune with Him. One thing let's just quickly go to is verse in chapter 1, Leviticus chapter 1. I'm just trying to find verse 3. It says that, let him bring it to the door of the tent of appointment, notice for his acceptance before Yahweh. In none of these passages, you can see that there's any mention about forgiveness of sin in this first chapter. So actually, there was still blood that needed to be poured out, and blood does and can mean forgiveness of sin. But in this case, the blood that was being poured out is more as a prerequisite before we come to Yahweh. It's incidental to the offering itself, but the focus of the offering is not about forgiveness of sin in the context of this particular offering. The focus of this is that someone wanted, out of their own, voluntarily, they wanted to give an offering to Yahweh, and which they get no benefit from, but they're fully just devoting something to Him. The second offering is the grain offering in chapter 2. And this is also similar to the burnt offering in the sense that in the Hebrew, the word is mincha, which means a donation or a gift. And that is also another voluntary offering. But who typically brought the grain offering was the poorest people who couldn't even afford the pigeons or the doves. If you recall, when Yahshua went into the temple 2 times, actually, in the first year of his ministry and in the last year, I think it was the second time, and he drove out the money changers and people who were doing what? Selling birds and animals in the temple. Because when people were going to go to the temple and they needed these animals, where better place can you go than to buy straight in the temple itself from other people? So people actually turned that into a business rather than what Yahweh intended was a house of prayer. But the point is, people would buy these birds and other animals if they didn't have it in their possession already. But not everyone could even afford birds. So some people who were quite poor, they actually, what they did, they gave it's basically the poor man's food that he is offering. His own food, the grain that he would be using to support his own family and eat, is what he is offering to Yahweh. Actually, in verse 3 of chapter 2, it says, this is most set apart of the offerings by fire to Yahweh. Why does chapter 2, verse 3, why is he calling it the most set apart of the offerings by fire? Because from Yahweh's perspective, it is as though that poor man is offering his own life to Yahweh. In contrast, a rich man giving from his wealth, whereas a poor man giving his own food, all that he can afford, which one is more precious? In that sense, is the one who can't afford anything and still is giving. It's like that widow who put 2 coins in the basket, and Yahshua said she has offered more than these other rich people which are coming with big bags of money. And so Yahweh has value not to the amount that we give, but proportionate to what we are able to do. Sometimes also the common people would offer the grain offering, and especially after a harvest of wheat or barley, when the new grain comes in, and they wanted to give a thanks to Yahweh that they've done the work, and they from the work and the labor they've done, they're making a devotion to Him. So what was offered in the grain offering? It was a grain, as you can tell. typically wheat or barley, and also to that they would add three things. One is olive oil, pure olive oil, frankincense, and salt. This is the only offering which didn't have any blood poured on the altar. And this could be offered anytime, but typically during after the harvest. Where could this offering be done? It had to be brought to the altar, as I mentioned, but not only at the altar, the priest would also take a portion of it back home and share with their family as well after they performed the sacrifice. Now, how was this offering done? What sort of things could the people bring? There's a couple of different ways they could bring this offering. They could, yeah, they could bring cake.
Parched grain.
Yeah, so they could bring the raw grain itself or roasted grains. So they could bring the roasted grains. They could cook it in an oven. If they cook it in the oven, there's two types. Either they can make a loaf cake mixed with oil or wafers. And if it was wafers, it should just be anointed with oil on the top. The third way is they can fry the bread in a pan, in a shallow pan. The fourth way is they could fry it in a deep pot, basically like today how you'd say deep frying something. You can fry a bread deep fried. But when they cook this bread, this grain offering, no honey was allowed to be mixed with it. And when the Bible talks about honey, it's not only bee honey, but also syrup from figs and dates and cane. Also, none of that could be used. And the priest would take a portion as a remembrance and as a reminder for the priest. They would take the remainder for the priest. And the main reason why was this, it's typically, as we mentioned, it is for a poor man to commune with Yahweh instead of the animal as per the burnt offering in the first example. Is that all clear so far? The two burnt and the grain? Okay. Now the third offering in chapter 3 is about the peace offerings. In Hebrew, the word peace offering is shalamim. And what it means is to make peace, to make perfect, whole, or complete. When you think about making peace, what does that sound like? What does making peace sound like? What does it? Yeah, okay, that's true. What does it mean?
To be in good terms.
To be in good terms? Yeah. What? Anything else? What does it mean to make peace?
Not to make angry.
Not to make angry. Okay, no.
Shake hands.
To shake hands.
Yeah.
But typically, when we think about making peace, it's usually after something that's gone wrong, isn't it? There's an issue, and then you make peace with someone. In the Bible, when it's talking about peace offerings, it's not actually about making peace, but rather that you're already on good terms with Yahweh, and now this offering is about being accepted by Him or showing thanksgiving to Him for something that He has done. It's about having a fellowship or communion after having already been made at peace with Yahweh. This is the only participatory offering. It's as though we are inviting Yahweh to our own home and saying, come, please share a meal with us. That is what the peace offering is signifying. You'll recall one thing in Revelation, Yahshua said, I stand at the door and knock, and whoever opens, I will come with him, sit with him, and eat. And that is what Yahshua and Yahweh want, is that intimate. When people sit and eat, usually that's the time people speak a lot. Either it's about the food or about something else. But sharing a meal is a common way we all do to build relationships. Even, when we go to work and someone will want to know you, whether if it's a client, they're trying to get in new business, or someone new that's joined to the team and then trying to build a relationship, what is the thing they usually ask? Let's go and grab a cup of coffee together. And over that cup of coffee or over a small meal, you build relationship. And that's what the fellowship meals are intended to do. So who could offer this fellowship meal? It's the common people. And the priest, of course, would have to be involved in all of these. Now, what could they offer? They could offer it had to be an animal, either from the herd. So a herd is either a bull or a heifer, a male or female cow, or from the flock, a sheep or goat, either male or female. So this is quite unique because not many offerings allowed the people to offer a female. Generally, it was a male that they had to offer. But in this case, females were also allowed for the peace offerings. And it could be done at any time. We'll quickly go to Leviticus 17. Leviticus 17, we'll just read the first couple of verses. And Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, This is the word which Yahweh has commanded, saying, Any man from the house of Israel who kills a bull or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or who slays it outside the camp, but does not bring it to the door of the tent of appointment to bring an offering to Yahweh before the dwelling place of Yahweh, blood guilt is reckoned to that man. It's as equivalent as though he has shed blood. He has shed blood, and that man will be cut off from among his people. And then verse 5, and they shall bring to Yahweh the door of the tent of appointment to the priest, the slaughterings of peace offerings to Yahweh. And then the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the slaughter place of Yahweh, on the door of the tent of appointment, and burn the fat for a sweet fragrance to Yahweh, and no longer let them slaughter slaughterings to demons, after which they had whored. So what this is talking about is actually when Israel was in the wilderness and they wanted to eat meat, they weren't just allowed to kill the animal and eat at home and cook for a dinner or for lunch, whatever it is they wanted to eat meat. What they had to do is actually they had to come to the tabernacle, offer it as a peace offering first, give the portion that was due to the priest and to Yahweh, and then with the rest, they can come home and take and eat the meat. That's how they were offering in the wilderness. But then in Deuteronomy chapter 12, and we don't need to go there, then Yahweh changed the rule. He said, because the problem is during the wilderness, everyone was all together and they were close to the tent of meeting. But when they gone to the land of Israel, now everyone is spread across the whole land. And it's not practical every lunch or every dinner, if someone wants to eat meat, to go travel all the way to Jerusalem, sacrifice the animal, then travel back home and share the meat with their family. That's not practical to do that. So Yahweh changed the law in Deuteronomy chapter 12, saying that when you enter the land, you don't need to do that anymore. You can still sacrifice to Yahweh, but you can do it at your home or at any place. But just make sure, don't eat the fat of those animals, which are supposed to be sacrificed to me, and don't drink their blood either. But you can sacrifice at home. And that's why when you read in the book of Kings, there's many different places people had altars. Like Shlomo, he went to Gibeon and worshipped Yahweh there. Eliyahu, he went to Mount Carmel where there was an altar dedicated to Yahweh. Like that, there was many different, it's just basically a pile of natural stones people would set up and kill that animal there and offer the portion to Yahweh, and the rest they'll take home and eat. But they didn't need to go all the way to the temple to do that.
So probably they were all vegetarians mainly
In the wilderness?
in the wilderness.
Mostly, yeah. Because if you want to do this every day, it becomes an inconvenience. Once in a while, it's okay, but you think like it's a very taxing job to kill an animal, to clean the blood, to wash it, and to cut it in pieces, to do the sacrifice, to take it back home. It's not a quick task. Like we go to the shop and buy, even when you buy from the shop, it already takes us probably an hour to prepare a piece of meat. Imagine starting with the live animal itself. It's going to be much more than an hour to do that. And also another example is before they were in the wilderness, Abraham built altars in many places. Wherever he went, he would build an altar and worship Yahweh. And probably what he was offering was basically a peace offering. But the reason why Yahweh commanded this thing in the wilderness, that they had to come and offer as a peace offering first, is because Israel had a bad tendency to offer to idols. And verse 7 says, to prevent them from doing that, he's made a commandment that they needed to bring it first to the tabernacle so that they do not offer to demons. So it was a preventative law that he had created for. So how was the peace offering done? Again, the man who was offering the animal, he would kill the animal before the priest, and then the blood would be dashed on the altar. So when the blood was poured on the altar, it was done with either a vessel, like maybe a cup, or with some hyssop, and they can sprinkle the blood on the altar. But the fat and the organs were to be burned to Yahweh. So that's the first part. There's three sets of people involved. Firstly, Yahweh gets his portion, which is the fat and the organs. It's not that he's actually eating it, but the portion which he says no one else is supposed to eat, it's dedicated to him. Then the second one is what goes to the priest who is doing the task. The priest will get what's called the right thigh, which is the thigh is like a very tender part of the meat. It's a very delicate piece. And then the other priests will get to eat the breast portion of the animal. And then everything else from the animal will go back to the offerer and his family to take home. So in the book of Samuel, Eli the priest, his sons, what they would do is they would not only take the right thigh and the breast piece, but they'd also take the fat as well. And the fat was belonging to Yahweh, or it was supposed to be dedicated to Yahweh, burned up to him. But they wanted more than what was allocated.
And they were taking the raw meat.
The raw meat as well, that's correct, yeah. And when the meat was brought back to the family at the home, it could either stay for 1 day or 2 days maximum, depending on what type of peace offering it was. We'll come back to that in a second. And so the lesson we learn is, because after 1 or 2 days, then if someone eats that meat, there would be, does anyone remember what the penalty is?
They have to be cut off.
Cut off.
Cut off, yeah.
What does cut off from the congregation mean?
No more part in the assembly.
Yeah, they're excluded from the community. Another way of what cut off can also mean as well too is that Yahweh would put a curse on the person so that they would not be able to have children as well too. So their family line could end there.
Cut off also means their life can be cut short.
Yeah.
Their lives can be cut short.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways we can understand that. But the point is the meat from the peace offering could only be eaten during a certain period of time. And what is the lesson we learn from that? The grace or the favor which Yahweh gives us through the peace offerings, which we share in his presence, it's actually a gift and a treasure from him. It's not something that we can treat as common because it lasts for a period of time. Unless we continue to find grace, as it says in Hebrews, we need to find grace before Yahweh. That's not a single day and then it remains forever. It's something we need to be on an ongoing process before Yahweh. And how we do that is actually by doing what he says and coming before him. In fact, I won't turn there to it now, but you all know the verse in Deuteronomy 16. It says, 3 times a year, all your males, basically the families, need to appear before Yahweh. That word appear is not just means come. Actually, what it's talking about is seeing the face of Yahweh. When we come before Yahweh, it's actually like we're seeing his face. And that is that ongoing level of relationship we need to have with him, is actually presenting ourselves before him regularly as he commands. And another way of thinking about it is like you can't eat the king's food at any time you want or at any way you want. You can't go and take, if the king invites you to a meal, you can't go take that food, go to the car and start eating in the car his food. You have to eat it at the place the king designates. So once that season of grace has expired, it's no longer acceptable for someone to consume the peace offering. The last thing I wanted to mention in the peace offering is there's actually 4 types of peace offerings. So the first one is the ones which are commanded by Yahweh at his appointed times, like the Sabbaths and the new moons and the festivals. The second one is thanksgiving offerings. So they're spontaneous offerings that someone will give to Yahweh after something special has occurred, typically a miracle. And that can only be eaten up to 1 day later, a maximum of 1 day. So that's in Leviticus chapter 7, verse 11 to 15. We're not going to go there. So the first one is at the commanded offerings, commanded peace offerings. Second one is thanksgiving offerings. The third type of peace offering is for vows. So that's when we request Yahweh to do something for us, and He does it, and then we will give an offering to Him when that is done. And that can stay for a maximum of 2 days. So the vow, there can either be a vow or a donation. And a vow is basically you're declaring to Yahweh that I will bring an offering if you do this for me. So in Leviticus chapter 22, I'm going to just quickly show 2 verses from here.
Leviticus 22.
22 verse 18. It says, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel and say to them, any man of the house of Israel or of the strangers of Israel who brings his offering for any of his," notice 2 words, his vows or his voluntary offerings, or vows or donations, you can say, like, which they bring to Yahweh as an ascending offering. And then verse 23 is the key verse I wanted to show. "As for a bull or a lamb that has a limb deformed or dwarf, you can prepare it as a voluntary offering or a donation, but for a vow it is not accepted." Do you see that? So, on one hand, if an animal gets a injury or a blemish, you can use it for a donation,
It's a voluntary offering.
voluntary offering, but not for a vow. So what's the difference? Because in the vow, you are making a commitment that you'll bring an offering to Yahweh. Whereas a donation is a person is dedicating, I am going to dedicate this animal to Yahweh. So once that animal is dedicated, even if afterwards a blemish comes or an injury comes, it is still acceptable to as a voluntary offering or donation, but not as a vow. Whereas if it was a vow, what the person would need to do is they would need to replace it with something else. So there is a distinction. So that's a third type. And the last one is the donations, and that is generally for drawing closer to Yahweh. So in summary, the peace offering is about making fellowship or sharing a meal and participating with. It's an invitation to Yahweh to come and share with you. The fourth one is the sin offering. In Hebrew, that's chatat, and that means to sin or to offend, to miss the mark on unintentionally doing things. And this is actually an obligatory offering. So when someone makes a sin by accident and it comes to their attention, they are required to offer this offering. It's not a voluntary one like the ones we mentioned before. And the people who can sin is anyone. It could be the high priest, it could be the entire congregation, the entire assembly, it could be the ruler or the common people. And depending on where they sit in the class, the weight that is associated with their sin differs. So a ruler who makes a sin is held more accountable than a common person making a sin. And so therefore they need to give a more expensive animal than a common person does. So in contrast, a high priest, if the high priest sins, they had to pay the same penalty that if the entire nation sinned. Because the high priest is representative of the entire nation, which is the most expensive animal, a bull, a young bull.
So saying that the high priest needs to be holy all the time.
Yeah.
Or he needs to be, otherwise the sin will be required, it will be transferred to the people also.
Mm.
But they need to be very careful all the time.
Yeah. And one of the other lessons we can think is that, when Yahshua took the sins, it wasn't of one man's sin. It was the whole world's sin that he was actually carrying. So the weight that the high priest, actually, the high priest wears on their shoulder 2 ephods, and from that ephods hangs 2 strings, and on those 2 strings is a heavy breastplate. And on that is the names of the Israel sons. And if you read, I think it's Exodus chapter 28, it says that he is supposed to carry on his shoulders the names of the sons of Israel. He's carrying the weight of the entire nation, the high priest. In contrast to the previous offerings where blood was brought to the altar, for a sin offering, the blood is actually brought inside the holy place. Not in the Holy of Holies, but in the holy place, the first curtain. So this is something that's quite different to the previous ones. So where is it to be done? It's to be done on the altar. The blood is to be brought inside the veil. But if the sin is done by the high priest or the congregation, the animal is actually supposed to be burned outside. It's like um, there's nothing that Yahweh finds pleasure in this particular offering. It's something that just needs to be done when there is a breach in the relationship. This is something that Yahweh requires to restore the relationship, not because he finds pleasure in it. And in Jeremiah and in Psalms, it says, I did not ask, I did not desire these sin offerings. So that's if the high priest or the congregation sins. They would burn the fat, the kidneys, and the liver on the altar, but the skin and the flesh would actually be burned outside. In contrast, if the ruler sins or the common people sins, then the priest actually has to eat the meat of the flesh of the animal, the flesh of the animal. And they sprinkle the blood with the finger rather than with a cup or hyssop. But one thing I want to show you is in chapter 6, verse 28 of Leviticus, how were they supposed to cook this animal for sin? Can someone read verse 28?
The clay pot.
Yeah.
28. But the earthen vessel in which it is cooked. Is it right?
Yeah.
Leviticus.
6, verse 28. That's the correct verse.
But the earthen vessel in which it is cooked is to be broken. And if it is cooked in a bronze pot, then it is scoured and rinsed in water.
Yeah. How does it read in the other translations? Scoured. Daddy, how does it read in yours?
Scoured.
No, not that word. The first sentence of that verse.
The clay pot in which it is cooked must be broken.
Okay. And in the King James?
Earthen vessel.
The first sentence of verse 28?
The earthen vessel where it is
Huh? The earthen vessel where it is?
wherein it is sodden shall be broken.
Sodden. Okay. So actually, the word which is translated cooked in these two Bibles is not very specific. Actually, if you look in the Hebrew, the word is specific, a specific type of cooking. It's boiled. Okay. It's supposed to be boiled and eaten by the priest. And what was the reason for the sin offering? It is to atone for sin, and it's expressing the individual's sorrow for a sin and their desire to reconcile with Yahweh. The last one is the guilt offering, which is chapter 5. In Hebrew, that's asham. And that means to become guilty or potentially offended. And the key word here is potentially. It's in contrast to the sin offering. This offering is for when people are unsure if they have sinned. Okay? I.e., there's a room for doubt or certainty. They may have sinned, but they do not know for sure. If a person later finds out that actually they did sin, then they will also need to offer the sin offering later. Okay? But this is like a temporary, I can't remember how I describe it out later. It's like a pending offering on the potential that it might be sin. What would have to be offered for the guilt offering is a female lamb or goat, not males in this context, or 2 birds, or 1/10 of an ephah of flour. And when was it for? So actually Leviticus 5 gives a couple of examples of when would these guilt offerings apply. So for example, if someone was unsure about a sin they committed, if let's say you saw a crime happen in the streets and you're a witness to it, but you didn't go and tell the police or the judge that you saw this person did this, you are actually held guilty in that matter because you did not disclose some critical information that would affect the judgment in this case. So that person would be required to offer a guilt offering. If you accidentally touch something which is unclean or a carcass without knowing, you would have to take a guilt offering. Or if you make an oath and you forget to do it for whatever reason, you'd have to take a guilt offering. If you derive common benefit from sacred articles or food unintentionally, or let's say you found something, you found someone's property, and okay, let's say you know it's something which belongs to your neighbor, you found their item, you kept it, and you didn't tell the neighbor. Then afterwards you realize, no, this is not right, I need to give it back. You give it back to the person, you even give him an extra compensation. That's not enough. You still need to you need to still perform this guilt offering on top of that, because actually in chapter 6 it's as though you're cheating Yahweh himself. He takes it very seriously. So unlike the sin offering where the blood is brought where? In the holy place. The guilt offering, the blood is not brought inside. It stays at the altar. Okay. And it's to be burned on the altar without oil, without frankincense, because Yahweh does not have pleasure in it. And so why would someone offer this? Is because they did not know if it was sin that they've done. So there's an example that was mentioned. Let's say someone in I looked in the Jewish commentary, an example of this. Let's say someone puts a piece of prohibited fat and permissible fat. There's two types of fat. Some is you're looking strangely. There's two types of fat, and not all fat is prohibited. Okay, like an example, fat from fish. There's no prohibition against that. The oil from the fish, you're allowed to eat that, which is actually fat. The fat which is described in the Bible, which you're not allowed to eat, is two types. One is if an animal has been killed by itself, you cannot eat that animal's fat. Like let's say a deer got hit by a car on the road. You can't go take that deer and eat that meat or its fat. Okay, that's the first example. And the second example is of animals which are sacrificial animals. So in other words, cows, lambs, goat, sheep. Those animals which are able to be offered to Yahweh are the ones you're not allowed to eat fat. So that's actually, if you want to check later, that's in Leviticus 7, verse 24 to 25, it specifies that. But going back to that example, someone puts in front of another person two types of meat, and there's also some fat as well, one which is prohibited, one which is permissible. And then that person eats it, and after he eats it, someone says, oh, that was fat, you're not allowed to eat. So in that case, he doesn't know for sure, but he mightn't have eaten what he should have. And so he would go and offer a guilt offering. If later he confirms the fact and realizes that actually it wasn't something he should have eaten, he'd also need to go and offer a sin offering as well. Or if someone goes into the temple and forgets that they are unclean for whatever the reason was, maybe they came into contact with someone who was unclean, then they would have to offer a guilt offering for that. So now, what is the main lessons from all these things, and what is the connection with the Passover? So I just want to spend a couple of minutes to summarize the key points from this. So Messiah, Yahshua, he fulfilled the sin offering. But actually, that's not the only offering he fulfilled. That is one of the many different types of offerings he fulfilled. And the problem is often when we talk about the Passover lamb, and our natural thinking is actually the Passover lamb signifying Yahshua, which is true, and it equals to the sin offering. That connection is not true. Okay, Yahshua fulfilled the sin offering, but the Passover lamb is actually connected not with the sin offering, but with another type of offering. With the peace offering. That's correct. So when we read in the book of Exodus, and even in the Gospels, when we
reconciled.
correct, we'll come to a few of those verses. When we read in the book of Exodus, where Passover is first mentioned, there's no reference to sin at all, okay, in there. Rather, the emphasis is on redemption. In what way? The firstborn males were going to be killed unless they had the blood of the lamb on the house. In which case, let's quickly go there in Exodus chapter 13, in just a few verses. Exodus 13, verse 1 to 3. And Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Sanctify to me all the firstborns, the one who opened the womb among the children of Israel from among men and among animals, it is mine. And Moshe said to the people, Remember this day. Which day? Passover. Passover. Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. For by the strength of hand of Yahweh brought you out of this place, and whatever is leavened shall not be eaten. And then verse 11 to 15. And it shall be when Yahweh brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall give over to Yahweh every one who opens the womb, and every firstborn which comes from your livestock, and males which belong to Yahweh. But every firstborn of a donkey you are to redeem with a lamb. And if you do not redeem it, you shall break its neck. But every firstborn of a man among your sons you are to redeem. And it will be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, What is this? What do you mean by all this? You shall say, Because by strength of Yahweh's hand we were brought out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And it came when Pharaoh was too hardened to let us go. Yahweh killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, but the firstborn of man and firstborn of beast he killed. Therefore I am sacrificing to Yahweh every male that opens the womb from animal, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem. So the emphasis in the Passover time is the redemption of the males, specifically the firstborns. In the book of Ezekiel, we're not going to go there, but actually you'll learn that Israel, Yahweh is saying very with heaviness of heart that when I brought you from Egypt, you still had your idols with you. When they were in the wilderness also, Amos says, you worship Ramphan and Molech and all these things. You think Yahweh showed all these signs and miracles and they were faithful to them? No. Israel was so unfaithful in the wilderness and even before the wilderness.
Not all of them.
Not all of them, but many of them.
Many of them.
Many of them. And so the thing is that Yahweh still showed mercy to Israel, even though the fact that they weren't yet first reconciled with him. Yahweh was still willing to skip over if they did what he's told them, which was the instruction to circumcise the males and to perform the Passover sacrifice and to perform the blood. Even if they were not Israelites, even if they were Egyptians or other nations, Yahweh would still show mercy to them. So you see that distinction, that actually it's about Yahweh showing grace, even though we were not worthy or deserving of it.
But we can't expect to push Yahweh to get that.
Yeah, we can't. But the point is, it's not in this case the sacrifice or the reward of this sacrifice was not contingent on the fact that they had to first be perfect. Still, Yahweh. That's what the grace actually.
That perfection is happening only through unleavened bread.
Yeah.
Because first one, he's not asking for any perfection at all. Passover time, it is just
Cleaning.
that is what it is. It is from Yahweh's side, he's doing his duty. And the second part is our duty.
Yeah.
That is the unleavened bread.
What do we mean by redemption? If you can go to this one, this is an important one to understand, the concept of redemption, because we use the term quite regularly, but I'm not sure if we all think about it with the depth that is appropriate to it. Yahshua gave an example, a parable. He said in Matthew chapter 18, verse 23, the kingdom of Yahweh is like a certain man, a king, who wished to settle accounts with his servants. And when he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents, a large amount of money. Someone had a huge debt, and he was unable to pay. And his master commanded that he should be sold, you can say, as a slave, and his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. And then the servant fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. How much patience can you have to pay 10,000 talents of silver? This is I don't have the figure here, but this is like a huge amount which someone actually can't repay back. Okay. I will pay you all. Verse 27, the master of that servant was moved with compassion and released him and forgave him the debt. And that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed just 100 denarii. It wasn't even a talent of silver. And he pulled him by the throat and said, "Pay me back what you owe." Then his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, "Have patience with me and I will pay you all." The same thing he said to his master. But he would not, and he went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. And when the fellow servants saw what he had done, they were deeply grieved and came and reported to their master all that had taken place. And his master called him and said to him, "Wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt, seeing you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant as I had compassion on you?" And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. So my Father in heaven also will do to you if from your heart you do not forgive his brother his trespasses. So what redemption is talking about is someone who is gone into slavery because they got a debt on them that they cannot pay, and someone else steps in, pays that debt, and rescues from slavery. That is what redemption is. If you think about Israelites, their firstborn had the penalty like all the other Egyptian firstborn, death. And there's no way they can pay a price to cover that life. But Yahweh gave them a way through the blood of the Lamb. And through that, their firstborns were saved, not killed. And the same thing for us as well, too. We have a debt from our sins that we could not pay. But it's through Yahshua's blood. He, with his own life, he covered that penalty and let us free from slavery to sin. So that's the focus of the Passover. It's the redemption rather than the forgiveness of sin, which is actually more closely linked to the feast or the Day of Atonement with the goat offering of sin that is described as a sin offering. But Passover is about redemption or rescuing from slavery and bringing us closer to Yahweh, allowing us to come closer to Yahweh. So if I just quickly just summarize, almost finished. If we contrast the Passover with the sin offering requires an admission of guilt. But we looked at before, Israel still had idols and they were able to partake in the Passover still. Even with the idols, still Yahweh showed mercy to them. So it was not because they had acknowledged guilt and they had been forgiven. It was actually because of something else, because of their actions, Yahweh showed mercy to them. The second one is that Passover lamb had to be roasted in the fire, but we learned that the sin offering had to be, how was it supposed to be cooked? Boiled. It's very different. The Passover offering also had to be eaten by the entire household. But the sin offering, no one could eat. Only the priest, in some instances, if it is by the common people. The entire Passover lamb needed to be roasted, whereas for the sin offering, the skin, the flesh, and the internals needed to be burned outside. Similarly, the Passover could be eaten at home, but the sin offering could only be eaten in the holy place. And Passover required cleaning before the thing. Remember, they had to do a washing before the Passover. They had to be circumcised and prepared before the Passover. But sin offering, there's no cleansing before the sin offering. It's when they perform the sin offering, afterwards they become cleaned. So there's a number of differences. If you contrast it with the peace offering, specifically the Thanksgiving offering, it's about celebrating something that Yahweh has done for us. Okay. In the case of Israel coming out from Egypt, it's that Yahweh didn't kill their firstborn sons and he's brought them out of slavery. The meat had to be eaten the same day and not left until the morning, exactly like the Thanksgiving offerings. And it could be eaten at home, not in the tabernacle, exactly like the Thanksgiving offerings. So the Passover themes, when we read in the Gospels, it's about fellowship with the Father and the Son. Remember, Yahshua said, "I pray that these may be one with us, as I am with you and you are with me." The focus of Yahshua's message on the Passover night was about us being united with Yahweh and through Yahshua, and the peace and the joy that we are to get from it. In Luke 22, verse 15, Yahshua said, "With desire, I have desired to eat this with you." the peace offering is about Yahweh and man coming together, or Yahshua and us coming together. Yahshua keeping it by himself is not achieving that task. And Yahshua said, I'm not going to eat this again until the kingdom comes, when I will eat it with you again. So Yahshua wants that communal meal together, that time to spend together. That's what he's looking for, and that's what the peace offering is symbolizing. And also another thing to note is that it's not going to be fulfilled until the kingdom comes. Many times we think the Passover is fulfilled. No, the Passover is fulfilled up to a certain point, but only when the kingdom comes will it actually be fulfilled. Whereas the sin offering is fulfilled. That one in Hebrews, it says it's one sin offering once and for all. Okay, there's no more another sin offering to be done. So the Passover is about redemption from slavery to sin, and also about a future final redemption. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 10, there's this song we sing regularly. What is it? I forgot how the name of the song. He's the mighty one of Israel. And in verse 29, Isaiah chapter 30, verse 29, it says, let this song be to you as in the night set apart for a festival, and gladness of heart who is going with the flute, and come to the mountain of Yahweh, to the rock of Israel, and Yahweh will cause his glorious voice to be heard, and so on and so forth. It goes on. You see how 29 starts. You will sing the song in the night like on the festival day. How did the Jews understand that? You remember when Yahshua had the Passover after that, what did they do? They went to the mountain and they were singing a Hallel, a praise psalm from 114 to 118. Because the Passover night, when they left Egypt, they were singing praises to Yahweh. Like how they came out of Egypt singing praises to Yahweh, Isaiah says, there's going to be coming a future redemption, where in the night, notice, in the night, just like at Passover, you're going to be singing a song of praise like in that festival time. So what the Jews say in this, if you look in their commentary on this verse, is actually that Passover is the night of redemption, or the day of redemption. And that actually kind of makes more sense when you think about it, because the coming of Yahshua, we normally focus on the end, okay? But Yahshua, when he comes, he's got a lot of things to do. And it's not called only the day of Yahweh, but it's called the year of Yahweh. All the festivals of Yahweh is going to play a very important role when Yahshua comes, and probably most likely beginning with the Passover. It's not a single snap done like that. You wake up and it's over. He's literally carrying and rescuing what we would call today refugees. Right? His people, Israel, is going to go as slaves and captives into various lands, and he's going to be rescuing them, bringing them back home. And the people are going to be going with tambourines at the front, it says in Psalms, and singing and dancing and praising. He's going to be turning the wilderness into roses, and all these things is going to come out. And in the book of Zechariah, it also says Yahweh is coming from the south. He's making a journey. He's coming to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the destination. It's not the starting point. And that's where he's bringing his people to there. And in the book of Corinthians also, Paul talks about, in the context of Passover, he says, I'd rather you should be having fellowship with Yahshua, not with demons. But notice the word he says is fellowship in the context of Passover. And fellowship is basically what the peace offerings are symbolizing. So the focus on the Passover is less about sin than about drawing closer to Yahweh and fellowship with the Father through Yahshua and that final redemption. In contrast, the goat of atonement is more about the sin offering role which Yahshua's sacrifice has. So as a final verse, we will go to Colossians chapter 1, verse 20. Verse 18 first. And he is the head of the body, the assembly, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that he might become the one who is first in all. because in him all fullness was well pleased to dwell. And notice, through him to completely restore to grace to himself all things, whether on earth or in the heavens, including the angels. Yahshua is restoring all creation to Yahweh, and notice, having made peace through the blood of his stake. Through his blood, one of the key roles of Yahshua's sacrifice is to make peace and to reconcile humankind and angelic kind to Yahweh. So Yahshua's sacrifice has multiple roles to play. One is certainly for sin and forgiveness, but also at the Passover time, the focus is about
Peace.
making peace, bringing together an acceptance and partnering or uniting with him and with Yahweh. So they all have all the different feasts and the sacrifices in the scripture. They show different aspects of Yahshua's sacrifice, but the focus of Passover is primarily two things. One, it's about drawing closer to Yahweh through Yahshua, and secondly, it's thanking him for the redemption that was provided in the past back in Egypt, the ongoing redemption he gives us today from slavery to sin, and the future final redemption that will come when Yahshua returns. So that's the link between the Passover offering and the peace offerings
From slavery
that we wanted.
to sin or slavery of sin?
What is it?
You said slavery to sin.
Slavery to sin. Yeah,
Slavery.
that's how in Romans it
Okay.
describes you no longer slaves to sin, but servants to Elohim is how it describes. So they're the two. They all link to that one sacrifice. It's not that Yahshua has multiple sacrifices, but the aspect that is emphasized on the Passover is those two things: it's redemption and drawing closer to Yahweh through him. That's it.
So basically, in Egypt, they had the opportunity for the Egyptians to keep the Passover.
Mhm. If they did the circumcision, also the Egyptians could.
So without the circumcision, they were not.
They weren't allowed to do that. Yeah. So it actually, there was a verse in the in Exodus where it says, if the stranger wants to participate, well and good, but he needs to first circumcise. And that's why, when they built the golden calf, who was primarily instigating it was not the Israelites.
The multitude.
It was the mixed multitude. And Yahweh says, it's your people to Moshe.
So what happens if somebody in Israel kill a lamb and then put the blood on the Egyptian's doorpost? Will they be saved?
I don't know. Yahweh can see and know all things. So.
I don't think he can be.
But
marked
I
as
think the Egyptians were allowed to go into the Israelites' house also.
Mm. But it's not only that, what they were prohibited was from eating the Passover.
Hmm.
So
Eating
maybe,
the Passover is one thing,
yeah,
but they should be able to get the protection
yeah,
in that night
yeah, that's right.
if they were with the Israelites.
Because even some of the plagues, many of the Egyptians actually listened to what Moshe said.
Mhm.
They brought their animals away from the
Yeah, and
hail
they
and
were
they
saved.
And they
saved.
were protected, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Passover is kind of a protection also for
Mhm.
those who are obedient,
Yeah.
whatever the. Okay,
That's it. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you.